A very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining this conference. My name is Ruud de Mooi, as Ceci said, and I wish everyone a very warm welcome to this joint conference organized by the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF and the Tax Administration Research Center at the University of Exeter. So I think the conference will provide a very nice mixture of different types of sessions. We have research papers that will be presented. There will be keynote addresses. We have panel discussions, and we will start off with a few introductions. And I think what is very nice is that this conference also brings together the research community and the policymakers that have to deal with the various tax policies and tax administration measures related to COVID-19. So tomorrow's program is primarily focused on revenue administration issues. Today we focus primarily on tax policy issues. And I'm very much looking forward to the conference and also to this first session. This first session will be welcomed by first Vito Gaspar, who is the Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department, and then by Christos Katsogiannis, who is the Director of the Tax Administration Research Center. So with that, Vitor, over to you.
Thanks so much, Ruud. It is a pleasure to be here, and it is a pleasure for me to welcome you to this conference on behalf of the IMF. I want to start to thank our partners, TARC, for the very good partnership in organizing what looks to be an outstanding program for a two-day conference. Since we are all professionals and we all give priority to substance, let me spend a couple of minutes talking to you about an issue which is at the top of my list of concerns. A couple of years ago, we at the IMF produced estimates of financing gaps for low-income developing countries in connection with the aspiration of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We focused on a subset of activities that we thought were priorities for the role that the budget must play in a process of development. The financing gaps that we identified were quite sizable for many of the low-income developing countries in the order of two-digit numbers as a percentage of the country's respective GDP. Now, as we cover in this conference, we are facing COVID-19, a very persistent pandemic, and according to our estimates, the impact on the path of growth for low-income developing countries will be very persistent. To be more explicit, these countries are projected to be, over the medium term, below the path of growth that we projected pre-pandemic. Even more to the point from the viewpoint of this conference, we have the same for the tax to GDP ratio. So over the medium term, we expect the tax to GDP ratio for this group of countries under unchanged policies to be below what we anticipated before COVID-19. That is, the financing gaps that are associated with the process of development have, if anything, become even more pressing, if anything, even more dramatic. And you have to realize that for this group of countries, the countries that are at debt distress or at risk of debt distress has increased from less than 30% in 2015 to more than 60% now. And this gives you an idea of the magnitude of the challenge that the topics that we will be discussing today and tomorrow has for the group of low-income developing countries. So this is the most dramatic challenge that I want to put on the table right at the beginning of this conference. And if that's okay, Ruud, I stop here.
Thank you so much, Vitor. No, this is an excellent setting the stage for the entire conference, the challenges countries are facing. So thank you so much for this. Next, Christos, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Ruud. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you join us from. My name is Christos Kotsogiannis. Let me repeat that. And I'm also the director of the Tax Administration Research Center, which is based at the University of Exeter Business School. And it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you to this two-day virtual event, which is jointly organized with the International Monetary Fund, the Fiscal Affairs Department. And I would also like at this stage to thank our colleagues at the IMF, the FAD, for a wonderful collaboration over the last few months. I'm sure things will run smoothly and very productively. Now, the world is going through an exceptionally challenging period caused by a global health pandemic, followed by economic downturn, and the crisis is unfortunately far from over. There are new variants coming through, and there's significant uncertainty looming over the economies. The projected positive growth of global GDP is subject, of course, to the risks of how the pandemic evolves in the coming months, and of access to vaccinations, particularly for developing economies. Now, in a fiscally constrained environment, more than ever before, we need well-designed tax and tax administration policies to respond to the crisis, boost economic revival, and meet, as Vitor said, the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, to protect lives and maintain business continuity, over the last year or so, we have seen governments implementing a plethora of relief measures, spending billions of dollars in assistance. But that has resulted in increased borrowing to unprecedented levels. The pandemic has also played a catalyst role in driving digitalization in government, presenting new challenges and opportunities, something that at the center we have been working on, researching on over the last year. Some of the work is going to be presented in this conference over these 2 days. This today virtual event, as noted earlier, is going to bring together practical experience for policymakers and frontier academic research by scholars. This engagement and a series of expertise between policymakers and academics is very much needed for us to find solutions that will get us out of the crisis. Now, the event, through a number of presentations and roundtable discussions, will focus on some of the key lessons learned from the fiscal actions taken by governments responding to COVID-19, but also reflect more broadly on the tax and tax administration policies, which can be used in such an uncertain environment and within the capacity constraints the countries face, something that's going to be discussed later on today in one of the plenary sessions. Within the constraints of this virtual world, we would like, both the FAD, IMF, and ourselves would like to make this event as engaging as possible. So what I would like really to encourage you is to send your views and questions to the speakers and panelists using the chat box. Having said that, I would like to wish you a very pleasant and productive conference. Back to you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christos. No, I think these are excellent opening remarks also to further set the stage and touch upon some of the issues that will be covered during the rest of the conference. So we have a very interesting program ahead of us. So we will start this morning with 4 presentations of research papers. So the first paper that we will start off with is by Giulia Mascagni from the International Center for Taxation and Development, where she is the research director. And she will be talking to us about a research project on Rwanda. So with that, Giulia, the floor is yours.
So thanks again. My presentation today is about a paper. It's called The Tax Side of the Pandemic. And I will discuss particularly results on shifts in tax perceptions and compliance behavior in Rwanda during the pandemic. This is joint work with my colleague Fabrizio Santoro, who is also from the International Center for Tax and Development and the Institute of Development Studies. And it was done in close collaboration with the Rwanda Revenue Authority. So let me give you the motivation for this study first. There's been a lot of new knowledge, as we all know, on the impact of the crisis, and I personally have been struggling keeping up with it, as perhaps many others in this conference. But still, there is quite little that we know about the impact of the crisis on taxation, and particularly on taxation in low-income countries. What we know is that the crisis has had a pretty severe impact on tax revenue. So there have been studies that either estimated or quantified the actual decrease in revenue, but there are quite a few questions that still remain unanswered. For example, did the crisis affect perceptions around tax and how? And did it affect compliance behavior and how? And you might think, amongst all the economic impacts, why should the crisis really affect compliance perceptions and behavior? And if anyone is asking themselves this question, I'd like to respond with a quote that was actually used by Pope Francis at the height of the crisis, at least in Italy. This was March 18th, 2020. And quoting an Italian journalist and endorsing his view, he said, it has become evident that those who do not pay taxes do not only commit a felony, but also a crime. If there are not enough hospital beds and artificial respirators, it is also their fault. So I think you couldn't make it clearer that tax evasion is linked to public services. And one view here is that during the crisis, tax compliance might have increased exactly because people make the link between tax and public services a lot more clearly, and because the importance of public services is very salient, especially healthcare. But there is also an alternative view, which is that at a time where most people and firms are experiencing incredible hardship, paying taxes and being compliant with tax laws can actually be seen as an additional burden at an already difficult time. So perhaps evasion is more justified, exactly because it's an exceptionally difficult time. So there are those two views, and I'm going to show you how it plays out in Rwanda, and I'm going to show you a fairly positive story from Rwanda, really. How we do that? We use a survey, which is the Rwanda National Taxpayer Survey. It is a nationally representative sample of 2,000 small and medium firms, all of which are registered with the Rwanda Revenue Authority. The survey, which I'm going to call the baseline, was collected for an entirely different purpose, also related to tax, but separate from this paper, in January and February 2020. This was a time when COVID-19 existed, but it mostly existed in China, or at least we didn't know that it existed elsewhere. And certainly nobody was yet expecting a global pandemic at this time. There was no case confirmed in Africa, and the COVID-19 hadn't been declared a global pandemic. So we collected this survey in person before the pandemic began. As the pandemic hit a few weeks later, we thought we were probably in a good position to see how the information on perceptions and attitudes that we had collected in this survey changed during the pandemic. So we decided to collect a few rounds of follow-up data in May 2020, September 2020, and February 2021. This time we were in a world with a pandemic, so we did it by phone. And we used exactly the same sample. So we went back to the same 2,000 firms, And we asked the same questions on attitudes and perceptions so that we can see how responses to these questions change in the same sample before the pandemic and at different stages across the pandemic. All 2,000 firms in the sample have at least one observation at baseline and one follow-up, and the great majority are observed in all the data rounds. The other interesting feature about our data is that we can match the survey data with administrative data from business income tax returns. And that means that we can observe not only attitudes and perceptions, but also actual reporting behavior. So here I want to give you a sense of the timeline of the pandemic and also our data collection. So above the timeline, you have the key developments in the pandemic in Rwanda. Below the timeline, you have the timing of our data collection. So as I said, the baseline was collected in January and February 2020 in a world without a global pandemic. A few weeks later, on 14th of March, the first case was confirmed in Rwanda. Just a week later, the government announced a national lockdown, which lasted for 6 weeks and was pretty strictly enforced. A few days later, on 24th of March, the government announced a package of tax relief. And our first follow-up data round happened right after this national lockdown in May 2020. Then from May to January 2021, there was a relatively more relaxed period with still some cases, but low case numbers and softer restrictions. And it is around this time that we collected the second round of data in September 2020. In January 2021, there was a spike in cases again in Rwanda, which triggered another lockdown. And this time it was localized in Kigali, the capital city, and it was only a couple of weeks long. And it is at the end of this second lockdown that we collected the third round of data in February, sorry, it should say 2021. So we have a data from a world without pandemic, and then at the height of the pandemic, relatively more relaxed period, and then again, when infections were increasing again. So during the pandemic in Rwanda, the government has responded, like in many other low-income countries, with quite quick and strict restrictions to increases in case numbers. So as everybody in this conference probably knows, the case numbers in Rwanda, but also in many other low-income countries, have remained lower than what we've seen in higher income countries. But as soon as they were rising, many governments, not all obviously, but certainly the Rwandan government was acting quite quickly and quite strictly. At the same time, the government was also providing general support to people and firms, and also tax relief. We asked our respondents how satisfied they were with this government response, and 80% said they are at least satisfied, 8 out of 10. So pretty good satisfaction with how the government handled the crisis. At the same time, the crisis had a pretty severe economic impact. 2/3 of the firms we interviewed in this survey stopped operating entirely during the national lockdown. This is a confirmation that the lockdown was enforced quite strictly. The sales they self-reported in the survey dropped dramatically, about 85% during the lockdown. And perhaps even more importantly, they only recovered to just about over half of the pre-crisis level by February 2021. So having set the context, now let me get to the main results, which are shifts in compliance attitudes and behavior during the pandemic. I'll start with attitudes and perceptions. So to do this, I use the survey data and a fixed effects estimation. So you have an equation there. I'm not going to go into the details. I'm just going to say that what we're doing here is trying to see how 6 outcomes of interest, which I'm going to define in a second, change throughout the pandemic. So in the next slide, I will show you the results for coefficients beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. What these coefficients tell us is whether the outcome of interest was increasing or decreasing during the various stages of the pandemic. So for example, if beta 1 is positive and significant, it means that the relevant outcome has increased significantly in May 2020, and so on for rounds 2 and 3. Here are the 6 outcomes. The first one is unfairness, and it measures agreement or disagreement with the statement the tax system is unfair. The second and third outcomes are really coming from the same question. So these are 2 sides of the same coin. So we asked respondents whether they agree more with one statement or the other. So with unconditional compliance or with conditional compliance. The unconditional compliance statement goes, taxpayers must pay their taxes to the government regardless of the quality of public services. So they could choose to agree with this or with the conditional compliance statement, which is taxpayers could refuse to pay taxes if they're not receiving public services of adequate quality. So they could choose either or. The fourth outcome is financial constraints. This is really related to one of the 2 alternative narratives I mentioned before. So we asked respondents to agree or disagree with the statement that taxpayers in financial distress could declare less income in order to pay smaller tax. So this is really about whether evasion is justified because of financial distress during the crisis. Then we have a measure of trust. So whether respondents trust that the RRA acts in the interest of taxpayers like them. And then finally, a variable that is very common in all the tax compliance literature that is based on surveys, which is never justify. We asked if they think it is never justifiable for people not to pay taxes on their income. So I'll just show you what we found. These 6 graphs come from 6 separate regressions, each one of them looking at the separate outcomes I just described. The dots there are the 3 coefficients, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3, corresponding to round 1, round 2, and round 3, so the different stages of the crisis. The dotted line is 0, so the farthest away our coefficients are from 0, the larger they are. The most striking results here are on unfairness and conditional and unconditional compliance. So let me start with fairness. What we see here is that there's significantly fewer people agreeing with the statement that the tax statement is unfair as the pandemic hit, and that decrease in perceptions on unfairness remains actually lower than baseline throughout the crisis. Not only this is a significant shift, but it is also quite sizable. So 40% fewer people agree with the statement about unfairness. This is an improvement in fairness perceptions, obviously, because of the way the question was phrased. Then let's look at conditional and unconditional compliance. What these results tell us is that there was a shift away from unconditional compliance. So fewer people agreeing that it is always an obligation to pay taxes regardless of the quality of public services, and moving towards a more conditional view of compliance, where taxpayers are really making the link between tax and public services a lot more clearly, and they're becoming perhaps a bit more demanding on the government to deliver adequate public services before they decide to comply. So this is what those 3 graphs on top tell you. I'm going to go straight to the one on financial constraints, because this is the one that measures the alternative view, and if so that evasion might be more justified during the pandemic because of financial distress and financial constraints. If anything, in Rwanda, it's the opposite. The negative coefficients tell you that the Rwandan taxpayers that we interviewed agree less that evasion is justified at the time of financial distress. So there's definitely no support for that view from our data. So overall, a positive shift in perceptions towards more fairness and towards conditional compliance, which can be seen as a positive development because it is obviously linked to issues around accountability, transparency, and citizen engagement with the fiscal system as a whole. Now I'm going to ask whether those shifts in compliance attitudes and perceptions actually translate in real behavior, which is what policymakers really care about. Do taxpayers actually comply more during the pandemic? To do that, again, I'm not going to go into the details of the equation. I'm just going to say that we now use the administrative data from income tax returns so that we can see what taxpayers actually declare and self-report in their declarations. And we use a different type of empirical framework, but it's quite different. And again, I'm not going to go into the details, but in the question and answer, I can answer any question on this if there's interest. The key thing here is that we exploit the fact that COVID appeared in Rwanda during the declaration period for income taxes, corporate income and personal income taxes. So if we go back to the timeline I showed you before, the red bits, what they show you is that the declaration period for fiscal year 2019, and fiscal year 2019 ends on the 31st of December 2019. Declarations are due between the 1st of January and the 31st of March 2020. This is when the pandemic began. For a good part of this declaration period, there was no pandemic. So for the good first chunk of the period, again, this was not a global pandemic and there was no case in Rwanda and anywhere in Africa, really, at least not that people knew of. But on the 14th of March, 21st of March, 24th of March, we used those three cutoffs to define the group of taxpayers who declare in a world where there is no pandemic, and the group of taxpayers who declare after the cutoff, after the pandemic becomes very much a Rwandan problem and very much a global pandemic. So the second group of taxpayers, they declare in a world where the pandemic exists. It exists in Rwanda, and they can actually adjust their compliance behavior accordingly. So we have a control group who declared before without a pandemic, and a treatment group, if you want to think about it that way, who declared during the pandemic and could therefore adjust their compliance behavior. We can use the three different, oh, I jumped to the end. We can use the three different cutoffs of 24th of March or the beginning or the first case or the lockdown. We decided to use the 24th of March, which is the announcement of the tax relief package, but our results really don't change whichever cutoff we use. The outcome we're looking at here is the self-assessed tax liability. So let me show you the results. What this graph tells you is that for the declaration period 2019, so for the fiscal year 2019, which is when declarations were submitted around the time of COVID, those who submitted with the pandemic are reporting significantly more than those who had declared before. This is not simply a matter of those who declared later in the declaration period normally declaring more than those who declared before, because in previous years, as you see for the coefficient from 2012 through to 2018, there was no difference between those two groups. So we attribute this effect to the pandemic. So the pandemic resulting in a large and significant increase in the tax liability of those taxpayers who declare after the onset of the pandemic. Now, these results are based on the administrative data for the survey sample, but obviously we have administrative data for the full population of taxpayers. So we asked, does it actually hold also for the full population? And this is a graph. And again, you can see the same results. So taxpayers who filed when the pandemic became a global and a Rwandan problem, declaring more than those who filed before. Okay, these were the main results. There are a few additional results in the paper. We have data and additional findings on tax relief, on public support for options to fund recovery, on informal taxation, and all of those results are available in ICTD working paper 129, which is available on our website. I just want to mention one thing of those additional results, which has to do with tax relief. And what I want to say is that tax relief doesn't really affect the shifts that I've shown you now on perceptions and behavior. So tax relief in Rwanda was mostly in the form of deferrals, meaning the tax declaration deadline was postponed by a few weeks because of the pandemic. But that didn't affect at all the tax liability, which is the main outcome of interest in the regression I've shown you about tax behavior. The other way tax relief could affect our results is, well, you know, if I'm a taxpayer and I received tax relief, that is probably why I think the tax system is now fairer. So to check for that, we have divided our sample between those who did receive tax relief and between those who did not receive tax relief, and check how our results change in the two groups. And again, the shifts in perceptions are very similar across the two groups. There is no substantive difference. So it is not just the case that taxpayers think the tax system is fairer because they have received tax relief. It's a more general thing. In addition to the results that are available in the working paper, we're also still working on this, and we are planning a new data round in February 2022. And we're particularly interested in seeing if, 2 years into the pandemic, our results change, particularly as solidarity feelings might be fading. Because what we see, and again, we can measure that with our survey, there was an increase throughout the period in solidarity and patriotism, which might be at the back of those positive results on compliance that I have just shown you. And also we have similar results on perceptions from Sierra Leone, which are being written up. So as I arrive at the end of my presentation here, I'm just going to give you a quick summary of the results. So I've shown you that tax attitudes and perceptions in Rwanda improved during the pandemic. Perceptions about tax unfairness improved by about 40%, and tax compliance became more conditional and linked to public services, which can be seen as a positive development. Compliance behavior also improved. We document a large increase in the self-assessed tax liability for those taxpayers who declare in a world where there is a pandemic. And this effect is largely driven by larger taxpayers. So when we split the sample between larger and smaller taxpayers, we can see that that increase in the self-reported tax liability really comes mostly from the larger taxpayers. And these shifts happened against the background of available tax relief for everyone, which however doesn't explain the two results above. An increase in solidarity and patriotism, which again we can measure and document with our survey, and high and increasing support for taxing the better off. So again, this is part of the results I haven't shown you, but we have asked people whether they support various types of tax options to fund recovery, and the one that received the greater support amongst the tax options was taxing the rich, and this is also the only one that increased throughout the pandemic, whereas other options actually, support for other options remained pretty much stable. So let me try to bring this all together and think, what does it mean for reform? So obviously tax revenue is key for recovery and beyond. I mean, low-income countries still have all the other challenges that they have been having for a long time, and they still need revenue to tackle all those challenges. So what these results show is that perhaps policymakers in low-income countries can actually leverage fiscal exchange and equity to improve compliance. How can that be done? Certainly with communication and sensitization, so linking taxation to public services, but also with effective communication campaigns on, for example, tax relief, other forms of government support, during the pandemic, but also more broadly. I think there is increasing evidence that small firms often don't take up provisions that are beneficial to them. So there is a role here for information and communication. But it is not only about communication. There is a need for actual policy change. And perhaps for me, the most obvious one is really to increase equity by improving taxes on the better off. And again, the pandemic might be presenting an opportunity here. There's a very strong rationale for improving taxes on the better off. That doesn't necessarily mean introducing new taxes, but enforcing better the taxes that already exist. And there's plenty of scope in low-income countries to do so. So I think I'm towards the end of my time, so I'm not gonna delve into that argument more. But if you want to see the argument in full, there's a blog that we recently published, and you can have a look. So thank you very much. And again, the paper is online as well as all the other materials. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giulia. No, this is a very fascinating research, and interesting to have this positive message from Rwanda. So the discussion will be started by Rebecca Sparkman. She's the Deputy Division Chief in one of our Revenue Administration divisions covering African countries. So Rebecca, go ahead.
Thank you, Ruud, and thank you very much for this really interesting paper. I really enjoyed reading it. And what was really interesting is really having this unique set of pre-pandemic data on the set of taxpayers and then following it through the pandemic and using administrative data on top of that. It really brought some interesting insight, and also brings out some practical applications for tax administration and policymakers in Rwanda. So I want to bring out in my discussion 3 areas: conditional compliance that you discussed, general compliance in the set of the 2,000 taxpayers using the study, and taxpayer knowledge. So on conditional compliance, your results did show that attitudes shifted with that greater linkage to good public services and paying taxes, wanting to see their dollars in action. And it improved the perceptions of the fairness of the tax system. Some of these linkages were new with the pandemic, with the government responding decisively at the outset of the pandemic and with reliefs to citizens and taxpayers. But some of these linkages in Rwanda were already in place. They were preconditions. For example, you bring out in the paper the perception that health services are good in the country. So these perceptions already existed pre-pandemic. But still, the survey showed that the attitudes shifted and suggested that compliance did improve past the already existing attitudes. And then also you brought it out, this attitude in informal payments, which was kind of interesting because you suggest, of course, informal payments as a form of tax, but really they had a greater linkage to their payments, seeing them in action through these informal payments. But that is still something that could be capitalized on by government, is to bring out, as you say, the communication and how to really connect the taxes to what they're getting in good government. And then you discussed the attitudes shifting towards solidarity and patriotism. And I think you suggested at the end there about, does solidarity fade? And that's the biggest question, as the country bonded together with a common enemy, the pandemic, people were called to action. And what happens when the pandemic fades? Will the memories be short? That'll be the question. So I really look forward to your data that you're looking to do for 2022. The second area is general compliance and the data set. Now, I will tell you that the taxpayer data wasn't surprising, but it was troubling to me. It wasn't surprising because in low-income countries, these are kind of what we see in tax registrants, because you looked at who was registered. And of your data set, 23% did not file, 25% filed, but filed zero sales and income, which left 52% filing with some kind of sales or income, 1,000 taxpayers. It suggested the focus of the evidence of the increased compliance really rested with those 52% who were already filing and paying something and already generally compliant. So that's an interesting, but it also is troubling because it's hard to know what the rest of them did. So obviously the ones who didn't file weren't in the data set because they didn't file. And then the nil filers, it's very unclear to me whether they actually improved and actually started filing sales, or if we just had the large taxpayers who you suggest generally stay the same for filing after this cutoff period were the ones who became more compliant since they were already compliant. So that is a question in my mind. But it did suggest that there was an impact on compliance, but maybe those who are more compliant taxpayers. And lastly, on taxpayer knowledge, we know this is critical for tax compliance. This is an important area. And we often look at taxpayer knowledge interpreting to a higher compliance level if they're knowledgeable or lower if they're not. But I also found it interesting that you looked at the other side and you looked at taxpayer knowledge contributing to missing out on tax reliefs that they may have been entitled to. And the lack of knowledge between the formal and informal contributions, in that the informal contributions is a sort of tax, and they don't see it necessarily that way. And then you further illustrate the gap or the need for taxpayer knowledge when you discuss funding the response and the recovery, which I know you didn't go into, but a fairly high percentage, of course, is in favor of taxing the more wealthy, but not in favor of property taxes, which you point out might actually be a tax on the wealthier in a low-income country. But generally speaking, increasing taxpayer knowledge is important treatment for tax administrations to improve compliance overall, and also in setting tax policies for equity and efficiency. So overall, I just want to say great job on this. And the question is, will Rwanda hold on to this? Will they ride the wave? Will they capitalize further on improved perceptions and interpret it to increased compliance over time, or will it fade? And then what are these lessons that they can take and then put into practice for setting policy and better administration? And I really would be interested in digging into those 23% non-filers and the 25% nil filers to see what their specific attitudes and their compliance change was, because it's hard to tell, especially the nil filers, the ones who filed zero sales. But I look forward to your expanded research in this area. Very interesting. And Ruud, I turn the chair back to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. No, these are excellent questions. Very good. I don't see questions in the Q&A yet, but I think it's very interesting to hear Giulia's response to some of these questions, and maybe say a little bit about how to what extent the results could be generalized, maybe beyond the people you had in the survey, and also maybe for other countries. So Giulia?
Yes. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for going through the paper, for offering your thoughts. They're extremely valuable, and obviously this is a work in progress. So I was taking notes as you were speaking. This is all very well taken. I'm not going to respond to everything because otherwise this will become a much longer conversation. But let me maybe say only 3 things. One is we did check for results differently between separately for non-filers, nil filers, and sort of active taxpayers. I don't remember if we have it in the paper, but it wasn't particularly enlightening. So there wasn't anything there that we thought is particularly easy to interpret or obvious, or an obvious explanation here. But I have to say that for the results on compliance behavior, there we cannot actually include non-filers because obviously our whole identification is when they file, and for them we don't have that. We did try to see if there is an effect on nil filing as opposed to the tax liability. And the results were very messy, but also we have a whole separate paper on nil filing, and we show that actually the result, the issue of nil filing is very complex, and it's not necessarily the case that those taxpayers are taxpayers who are evading and could be declaring something. Oftentimes these are firms that have been registered, often in those registration campaigns that can be also quite aggressive, and actually they are either below the threshold for being liable for any tax, or they maybe shouldn't have even have registered in the first place. That is also the case sometimes. So that is on that. I was also very surprised by the results on taxing the rich and taxing property, because yes, taxing property, if property taxes are designed properly, they are taxes on the better off. So there is certainly a role there for information. I think this probably has a lot to do with how people see property culturally as a way for families to maybe store wealth. And there is certainly a better job that the government can do to explain what these taxes really do in terms of equity particularly. Whether the results are generalized, well, to the broader population, at least what we can see from the administrative data makes me think that, yes, they're not specific to the survey sample, but obviously we don't have data on perceptions more broadly, so I cannot really speak to that. To other countries, the only other country where we were in a similarly lucky situation where we had a survey just before the pandemic hit is Sierra Leone. And there we see very similar shifts in perceptions as we see in Rwanda. The results are not exactly the same, but they go in a similarly sort of positive direction. So that is what I can say. I would also like to see more research on this from other countries, but I also realized that the setting is very specific to the situation we had in Rwanda.
Very good. Thank you so much. And I'm afraid time is already up. There's more questions coming in the Q&A now, but maybe we can arrange that these are answered in written form. So time to move to the next paper. But thank you so much, Giulia, and thank you, Rebecca, for this excellent first opening session. Thank you very much.